Are you tired of cookie cutter shoulder rehab advice that just doesn't work? What if I told you that the whole idea of bulletproofing your body is a scam sold by the rehab industry? I'm Jack Krucial, an injury rehab consultant, and I've personally overcome half a decade of shoulder injuries myself and helped clients around the world do the same. Now, before we dive into my elite approach to shoulder rehab, let's tackle a big myth head on. The term bulletproofing your body is thrown around a lot, but the reality is, it is a scam. No shoulder can be made invincible. You can greatly minimize injury risk, but to promise that you'll never get injured again is a false promise, and I refuse to lie to my audience and sell you guys false promises. What I will do, however, is reveal why traditional rotator cuff exercises, just like this one, are failing you and introduce a game-changing approach to shoulder rehab. I'm also going to share with you the 5 key movements with exercise demonstrations that will finally take you from pain to peak performance. If these topics interest you, consider subscribing. To begin, I'm going to teach you 3 key concepts: what the rotator cuff is, the rotator cuff tear types, and injury risk factors. Firstly, the rotator cuff is a group of 4 muscles. 4 muscle groups are the subscapularis, the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, and finally the teres minor. A common misconception is that bigger rotator cuff tears means that you are more likely to have more pain. This is not true. However, the larger the tear, the less stable and more likely that the tear will progressively get bigger over time. There are 2 main tear categories, which are partial, which you can see here, and full thickness tears, which span across the entirety of the rotator cuff tendon. Full thickness tears greater than 1 centimeter or 1/3 of an inch are more likely to progress to large tears. To keep this video to the point, if you want to learn more about rotator cuff tears, including when a surgical opinion is recommended, you can go and check out my Krucial shoulder protocol in the description of this video. The 3 biggest risk factors for rotator cuff tears are: 1. Age. If you're over the age of 65, you have a 25% chance of having a rotator cuff tear, and a 50% chance if you're over the age of 80. 2 is overuse. Swimmers, for example, complete 2 million strokes per year with their training, which places a large demand on the rotator cuff. If you're an overhead or throwing athlete, or you work a manual labor occupation, you need to ensure that you have a rotator cuff that is strong and capable of handling these tasks. And 3 is underuse. Interestingly, not training and loading your rotator cuff also increases the risk of tears, as the rotator cuff becomes weak over time if not used. Now that you understand what a rotator cuff tear is and the risk factors involved, what is the #1 principle of rehabbing a rotator cuff injury? Now, many rehab experts aren't aware of this, but the rotator cuff does far more than just internally and externally rotate the shoulder. These movements are demonstrated here, but they are also involved in flexion, otherwise known as raising the arm over the head, and the opposite action, which is called extension, and also raising your arms to the side, otherwise known as abduction. The 5 key movements that I'm going to teach you will not only develop a strong, robust rotator cuff, it's important not only to strengthen the rotator cuff, but the surrounding muscle groups, such as the traps, the scapulothoracic muscles, such as your rhomboids, your lats, your rear delts, your side delts, your chest muscles, and your front delts. When you teach your body to coordinate movement with all of the muscles of the shoulder, not just try and isolate the rotator cuff, you accelerate rehab timelines, and this is the secret to getting back to peak performance faster. The 5 key movements are pushing movements, pulling movements, raises, carries and hangs, rotations. I'll be giving you specific exercise examples, but if you want a full step-by-step process to rehab your own shoulder, go to the Krucial shoulder protocol. The link is in the description. Pushing movements. Now, pushing movements involve just that, moving your limbs away from the body, both in the horizontal plane, as you can see here, and the vertical plane when we're pushing up overhead. These exercises are an excellent method to train the chest muscles, the front delts, as well as the triceps. I'm going to share with you 2 specific pushing exercise variations. The first one will be a dumbbell bench press. The pushing action is also responsible for development of the front of the rotator cuff, otherwise known as the subscapularis. Now, the reason why I like to use dumbbell bench pressing variations for the rotator cuff is as I'm moving through space, the rotator cuff is avoiding the wrists turning as I'm coming down. it's stabilizing the position the whole time. So as I'm coming up and down, the rotator cuff is working hard to make sure that I'm stable. Those of you that don't have very good rotator cuff stability, you might notice that you're quite shaky like this as you're working through a heavy dumbbell bench press. And this differs to a barbell where you don't need as much rotator cuff stability. The second variation I like to use is a landline press, because as I'm pressing up into this plane, I'm getting a really good reaching position, which is going to fire the serratus anterior, a really crucial muscle group underneath here. What you do is you grab a barbell, you can wedge it between a squat rack if you don't have a landmine, and we're simply just completing a pressing action overhead and really reaching and slightly rotating through the spine. So we're getting a coupled movement of rotation and reaching simultaneously. This is one of my favorite exercises to give people for overhead pushing, but also starting to activate the rotator cuff effectively. These are two of my favorite variations to not only develop the front of the rotator cuff, but also build impressive and durable physique. Pulling movements. Pulling exercises not only involve development of the rear delts, the traps, and the lats, but they also develop the rotator cuff muscles found at the back of the shoulder. Pulling exercises primarily move a weight towards your midline and you retract the shoulder blade, as you can see in this demonstration here. I'm going to show you two pulling exercises. The first will be a rack chin. The reason why we're going to start with this exercise is there's a very low barrier to entry compared to doing a bodyweight pull-up or chin-up where you're suspending with your whole body weight, especially in the early stages of a shoulder injury. So there's two ways that you can complete this. Firstly, with an underhand grip, as you can see here. We place our legs up on a bench for support, and then from here we're simply just completing a pull-up variation or chin-up variation accordingly. So we're working the upper back, our biceps, and obviously most importantly, the rotator cuff. As you get more advanced, you can also complete this in a wide grip position and complete these same pull-up / chin-up variations. Second exercise will be a ring face pull. You can get gymnastics rings for around $20. One of my staple exercises for developing not only the back of your shoulder, but also the rotator cuff. So what we're going to be doing is setting up with a gymnastics ring. Our starting position will actually be up in this face pull position. Very common position. We're having the elbows flared up towards our face, and then we're simply lowering down, reaching all the way, and then coming back up into that top face pull position. So starting position here. Once again, I want you to reach all the way, allow your body to rotate slightly, and then come up and squeeze at the top. Common mistake is people arch their low back. We don't want to do that. We want to lower down and make sure that our torso stays very straight the entire time. I'm sure that you can see here that the theme is elite level rehab should look just like training. Raises. Raising actions are a staple rotator cuff exercise as you are activating both the front and back of the rotator cuff simultaneously. Having the entire rotator cuff working together in sync is otherwise known as a co-contraction. You get so much bang for your buck by using raising exercises. Now, instead of giving you specific exercise examples, I'm going to cover the principles of building into raises based on my experience as an injury rehab expert. Now, typically shoulder pain sufferers tend to feel better by starting in the frontal plane, which is the arms straight in front of the body. What I like to do to start with is do a kettlebell raise. The reason why is we can lift with both arms at the same time. We're not doing an isolated individual arm, so you can allow the non-painful side or the non-injured side to help support the action as you're coming up in front of the body. The next most tolerable variation is in a scaption plane, which is the thumbs up, raising into this position here. So if we use a light weight, we'd be coming up into this plane, and then you can add additional principles such as staying below 90 degrees, coming up to 90 degrees, and then raising above that 90-degree plane. Once that becomes very tolerable, you can then turn your thumb into your classic lateral raise position. As you can see here, once again, you can follow the same principle. Below 90, at 90, and then above 90 degrees. So these are just some really easy ways to work one of the most important rotator cuff exercises in the repertoire that we're teaching you today. Carries and hangs. Carries and hangs involve holding a suspended position, typically overhead, or carrying some sort of weight or object over a certain distance. Not only do these exercises develop the rotator cuff, but also the forearm muscles, as you can see here, as well as wrist strength and endurance. These exercises stimulate the rotator cuff to contract isometrically, which means it doesn't change in length. However, you are building stabilization and endurance properties with these exercises. Now, the farmer's carry involves holding a kettlebell, dumbbell, barbell, trap bar, whatever you want to use, and walking with that through a certain distance. Very important that you're using a heavy object, and I'll explain why that's the case. In this case here, we've got a heavy kettlebell. Naturally, my shoulder wants to drop down. For me to accommodate that and use the rotator cuff, we need to avoid this position and stabilize it. Basically, what your rotator cuff is doing when you're doing a farmer carry is avoiding the shoulder from dropping down and basically dislocating. So it's a great exercise in the early stages of not only rotator cuff rehab, but also shoulder dislocation rehab. And the second exercise is the classic dead hang, where we're holding this position for as long as we can overhead. So our rotator cuff helps stabilize the ball and socket joint like so, and prevents it from slipping. So this is a really good, once again, a static exercise, but you're also working on wrist, hand, finger, and grip strength and forearm strength as you're doing this exercise. You can play around with a variety of different grips. You can go overhand, you can do mixed grip, you can do both underhand, depending on what you're wanting to do. There's a variety of different ways that you can build into a dead hang. But the most important cue that I give to every single client is when you are hanging in this position, instead of sagging into the bottom of the rep, I want you to be slightly activated. So you can see we're at the very bottom here. I want you to raise up slightly without bending your elbows. And that just gives you a bit more rotator cuff activation, which I call an activated dead hang. Many of you have seen dead hangs being sold as a miracle cure for shoulder pain, which I disagree with personally. However, it's very popular for a reason. It works. Rotations. Now, most of the exercises that you are going to see online involve doing this banded rotator cuff exercise for days on end. Now, while this might be a viable solution in the early stages of shoulder or rotator cuff injury rehab, there are a bunch of other ideas and concepts I'm going to teach you now. So the first one I'm going to show you is we're going to bend one of our knees up into this position. We will place our elbow like so, and then we're going to internally and externally rotate from here. No matter what level of rotator cuff pain that you have, you can start with just body weight to begin with, but then you can add additional weight accordingly, like so. If you want to make this exercise easier, you can straighten your leg out so that you have less of a joint angle. If you want to make this harder, you have this higher up so that you're up, basically up in more degrees of abduction, which is this side movement here. So once again, straight leg, your arms lower down, typically more comfortable, coming up higher, more challenging. We're closer to this 90-degree position. So that's the first variation here. We're rotating all the way up to the top, and then we're coming down. As we're lowering down, the back of our rotator cuff is lengthening. As we contract up to the top position, the back of our rotator cuff shortens. Something that I like doing to further isolate the rotator cuff, using the bench as support. This is just much more comfortable in my opinion compared to that first variation. But obviously we're at this 90-degree position with our arms here, and then we just rotate through. So rotating down as far as you can, and then coming back up into that top position, like so. Now that you've learned the 5 key movements to truly strengthen your rotator cuff and the comprehensive approach needed for effective rehabilitation, it's time to take action. Remember, the idea of bulletproofing your shoulder is a myth, but you can achieve significant improvements and a high level of function with this strategy. If you want to work with me personally to address your shoulder injury, you can fill out an application in the description of this video. Don't let shoulder pain hold you back any longer. Subscribe to my channel for more expert advice on injury rehab, and join our community of individuals dedicated to overcoming injuries and achieving their physical best. Thank you for watching.